Nobody screamed. That's the part that keeps coming back to me. No shattering glass. No frantic phone calls caught on voicemail. No neighbors rushing out into the street. Just a quiet house in Brentwood, sitting behind hedges tall enough to keep secrets, doing what it had done for decades, holding everything in. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. That's how this story begins. Not with a headline. Not with a breaking news banner sliding across a screen, but with silence. And then a question that refuses to behave. What happens when the man everyone thought they knew turns out to be someone others quietly endured? Because for years, decades, really, Rob Reiner existed in a fixed position in the public imagination. Filmmaker, activist, the outspoken moral voice in a loud political era. A man who told stories about decency, justice, and the importance of saying the right thing at the right time. And then, suddenly, the story stopped behaving. A brutal double killing, a son in custody, a daughter using words that don't usually appear in first statements. And hovering at the edges of it all, unexpectedly, uncomfortably, the voice of a 92-year-old musician who had never spoken publicly about Rob Reiner before. Willie Nelson does not chase relevance. At this stage of his life, relevance comes to him whether he wants it or not. He doesn't give interviews easily. He doesn't correct the record. And he doesn't revisit old ghosts unless something has shifted so profoundly that staying silent becomes louder than speaking. So when Willie Nelson finally said, Rob Reiner was not the man you think he was, it didn't land like an accusation. It landed like a warning. And that difference matters. Because this is not a story about celebrity tragedy in the tabloid sense. It's not a courtroom procedural, at least not yet. And it's not an attempt to retrofit villainy onto a public figure because of the way his life ended. This is a story about delay, about truths that wait, about the cost of waiting too long. When the news first broke out of Los Angeles, 2 bodies found inside a multi-million-dollar estate, the early details followed a familiar script. Shock, condolences, a stunned community, the obligatory reminder of success, philanthropy, and public impact. But beneath that surface language, something else was happening. Something slower, more cautious. Law enforcement didn't rush to define motive. Family members didn't rush to explain relationships. And reporters who had covered Hollywood for years noticed something odd. The usual chorus wasn't singing in harmony. There were pauses where there shouldn't have been pauses. Words chosen carefully. Descriptions that stopped just short of comfort. And then there was that phrase. Dangerous family member. Not suspect. Not person of interest. Not even accusation. Dangerous. It's a strange word to use in the immediate aftermath of violence. It suggests history. It suggests memory. It suggests that what just happened did not arrive out of nowhere. It arrived from somewhere very specific. And that's where this story starts to lean away from the obvious. Because if this were only about a crime, the shape of it would already be familiar. Timelines. Evidence. Charges. A trial date circled on a calendar. But this story keeps pulling backward instead of forward. Back into old rooms. Old conversations. Old silences that were once framed as discretion, professionalism, or loyalty. Ask yourself something, and answer it honestly. How many people do you know who are exactly who they appear to be in public? Not mostly. Not eventually. Exactly. Hollywood, more than any other industry, survives on agreed-upon fictions. Not lies, necessarily. Just omissions. Strategic angles. The parts of a personality that photograph well, and the parts that are quietly cropped out. Rob Reiner understood that machinery better than most. He lived inside it, benefited from it, spoke against it, even while mastering it. Which is why Willie Nelson's timing is so unsettling. Not because he spoke, but because he waited. Willie Nelson was there for the long arc. The rooms before publicists. The conversations before reputations hardened. He watched people become symbols and then mistake the symbol for the self. And for decades, he said nothing. Until now. Why now? That's the question this story keeps circling. Because Willie didn't come forward during a scandal. He didn't speak during an awards cycle. He didn't attach his words to a documentary release or a memoir tour. He spoke after death. After violence. After there was no longer anything to gain. That alone should give you pause. There is a temptation, especially online, to rush toward conclusions. to decide that every revelation must point to guilt or innocence or some clean narrative resolution that allows us to move on. But this story resists that instinct. Every time it seems to present an answer, it introduces a contradiction instead. A son who lived nearby, but not inside. A daughter whose words carried fear, not certainty. A public figure whose reputation was built on moral clarity, and whose private life now appears anything but simple. And hovering above all of it, a voice that waited nearly a century to speak. Willie Nelson did not say Rob Reiner was a monster. He said he was not the man you think he was. There's a difference. One demands judgment. The other demands reflection. So let's slow this down. Let's resist the urge to decide who this story belongs to before we've earned the right to understand it. Because the most dangerous stories aren't the ones with obvious villains. They're the ones where everyone played a role, including the people who said nothing. And that includes Willie Nelson himself. Because the moment he finally broke his silence, he didn't just reopen the past. He changed the meaning of the present. And once you understand why he chose this moment, not earlier, not later, you start to see that the killings were not the beginning of this story. They were the interruption. But what comes next forces a far more uncomfortable question. What if the truth didn't surface because no one was ready to hear it? And what if, now, it's too late to pretend we didn't know where to look? But before we get there, before we examine the house, the family, and the word dangerous, we need to understand the place where this story ends. Because that place holds more than bodies. It holds the first crack in a very carefully constructed silence. And here's the unsettling part. That silence didn't just exist inside the house. It existed around it. Neighbors noticed how quickly the street returned to normal. Cameras came down. Vans left. The usual rituals of public grief appeared on schedule. Flowers, statements, carefully worded condolences. But they felt procedural. Almost contractual. As if everyone knew which lines to say and which ones not to cross. That's often how these things work when power has been in place for a long time. The language becomes preloaded. Everyone knows the shape of the response before the event even happens. And yet, even in those first hours, there were tiny fractures. Small enough that you could miss them if you weren't listening for hesitation. A reporter asking a question that didn't quite get answered. A family friend pausing too long before describing a relationship. A source saying, "I don't know how to explain this," and meaning it. Those are the moments that matter. Because real stories don't announce themselves. They leak. When investigators stepped inside the house, they weren't just documenting a crime scene. They were stepping into a life that had been carefully arranged, not just architecturally, but emotionally. Rooms with purpose. Doors that close quietly. Spaces designed to allow people to coexist without colliding. It's tempting to read symbolism into architecture, to turn houses into metaphors. I try not to do that unless the facts demand it. But in this case, the layout matters. Separate structures, clear boundaries, proximity without intimacy. That's not an accusation. It's an observation. And it raises a question that no one asked out loud in the first 24 hours. What kind of family needs that much space? Not physically, emotionally, because families don't fracture overnight. They fracture slowly, over years, through patterns that feel normal while you're inside them, until one day they don't. And that's where Willie Nelson comes back into the frame. Not as a witness to the crime, not as a character in the immediate drama, but as something far more disruptive. A long-term observer. Willie has seen what happens when people confuse public virtue with private behavior. He's watched careers built on ideals collapse under the weight of unexamined truths. He's also watched others survive not because they were innocent, but because they were protected. That kind of perspective changes the way you speak. It makes you careful. It makes you reluctant. So when Willie finally said something, not in anger, not in a tell-all, not with theatrics, it carried a weight that younger voices simply can't manufacture. And what he didn't say may be even more important than what he did. He didn't point fingers. He didn't name crimes. He didn't claim knowledge of what happened inside that house. Instead, he questioned a narrative. The man you think you know. That phrasing does a lot of work. It suggests distance between perception and reality. Between image and experience. Between who someone is in public and who they are when the doors are closed and the lights are low. Ask yourself something. How many people in positions of influence are known primarily through their values, not their behavior? It's an uncomfortable question, but it's one this story keeps asking. Because once violence enters the picture, everything before it gets re-examined. Conversations are reinterpreted. Silences are replayed. Decisions that once seemed benign start to look intentional. And that's dangerous territory. Not because it leads to truth too quickly, but because it tempts us to flatten complexity into blame. This is not that story. At least not yet. This is a story about context. About accumulation. About the slow erosion of certainty. And that erosion didn't begin with a knife. It began with patterns. Patterns of distance. Patterns of restraint. Patterns of people choosing their words carefully because they'd learned, over time, that words had consequences. That's why the daughter's phrase matters. Dangerous family member. That phrase didn't come from a legal manual. It came from lived experience. And it opens a door we can't close again. Because danger doesn't have to mean violence. It can mean volatility, control, unpredictability. The kind of presence that keeps everyone slightly off balance, adjusting their behavior to avoid setting something off. That kind of danger rarely leaves bruises, but it leaves something else. Memory. And memory is what Willie Nelson trades in now. Not nostalgia, not myth-making. Memory. He's at an age where the pressure to maintain someone else's story no longer outweighs the pressure to live honestly with your own. That's not bravery. It's clarity. And clarity, in stories like this, is often mistaken for accusation. But listen closely to what he actually did. He didn't say Rob Reiner was evil. He said he was not who you think he was. That leaves room. Room for complexity. Room for contradiction. Room for truths that don't fit neatly into verdicts. And that's precisely why this story refuses to resolve itself quickly. Because the moment we try to turn it into a morality play, we lose the thread. What matters here is not whether Rob Reiner was good or bad. What matters is whether the structures around him, family, fame, ideology, silence, allowed parts of the truth to remain unexamined for too long. And whether that delay had consequences. We're used to thinking of violence as an eruption, a sudden break from normalcy. But sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes it's the inevitable result of everything staying exactly the same for far too long. That's the unease that hangs over this case. Not just what happened, but what didn't. What conversations were postponed. What discomforts were managed instead of confronted. What people convinced themselves was none of their business. And what happens when all of that finally collapses at once. As we move forward, the temptation will be to assign roles. To decide who is victim, who is villain, who is unreliable, who is hiding something. We're going to resist that. Instead, we're going to do something harder. We're going to sit with the uncertainty. We're going to trace the outlines of a life that was lived publicly as a moral statement and privately as something far more complicated. We're going to examine why the people closest to the center spoke the way they did, cautiously, indirectly, sometimes not at all. And we're going to keep asking the question that Willie Nelson forced into the open simply by breaking his silence. What if the version of this man we were given was never the whole story? And what if the reason we're only asking that now has less to do with truth and more to do with timing? Because the house in Brentwood may be where this story interrupted itself, but the forces that shaped it were set in motion long before anyone called the police. And the next place we need to go, the place where this story actually tightens, is inside that house. Not on the night everything ended, but on the nights nothing happened at all. Because that's where the real danger tends to live. Did the house feel different before anyone knew why? That question kept coming up in the first interviews. Not directly, not on the record, but in the sideways language people use when they're trying to describe something that didn't announce itself. A heaviness, a quiet that felt managed, a sense that whatever lived inside those walls had been contained for a very long time. The house didn't scream when it was discovered. It waited. That matters more than it sounds. Because when investigators arrived at the Brentwood estate, they weren't stepping into chaos. They were stepping into order. Disrupted, yes, but not unraveled. Furniture in place. Doors where they belonged. No obvious signs of a struggle spilling from room to room. No frantic disorder that suggests panic taking over. Instead, there was precision. And precision tells its own story. People imagine crime scenes as explosive moments frozen in time. In reality, the most revealing ones are often the calmest. They suggest familiarity, routine, a sequence of events that unfolded without interruption or resistance. The estate itself had been designed to create separation. That wasn't incidental. Separate structures. Clear lines between private and semi-private spaces. The main house. The guest house. Paths that allowed movement without collision. Architects will tell you this kind of layout is about privacy, about hosting, about flexibility. But families live inside architecture in ways blueprints can't explain. Separation can be a luxury. It can also be a strategy. The guest house, where Nick lived, was close enough to hear the rhythms of the main residence, but far enough to avoid constant contact. Close enough to be present, far enough to be absent. That balance didn't happen by accident, and it's not inherently sinister. Many families choose similar arrangements for practical reasons. Independence, adulthood, boundaries. But in this case, investigators noted something subtle. There were no signs of recent shared living. No communal meals left behind. No overlapping personal items. No evidence that this was a house where people drifted freely between spaces. It was a house with lanes. That may sound trivial. It isn't, because lanes imply rules. Unspoken ones, perhaps. Expectations. Patterns of behavior that everyone understands without needing to articulate them. And when those patterns are disrupted, the disruption tends to be internal long before it becomes visible. This wasn't a house where arguments spilled into hallways. If arguments happened, they stayed contained. That's an important distinction. Neighbors described the family as private. Not reclusive, not hostile, just closed. The kind of closed that doesn't draw attention to itself. The kind that signals, politely, that you won't be invited in. And that image, controlled, reserved, orderly, aligned perfectly with the public reputation of Rob Reiner. A man known for his convictions, for speaking clearly, for moral certainty. But certainty, when it hardens, can become something else. Inside the house, the investigation began with routine documentation, photographs, measurements, notes, the language of procedure. And yet, even in those early steps, officers noticed an absence that didn't sit right. There was no obvious escalation, no broken objects suggesting rage, no overturned furniture, no signs that anyone tried to flee or barricade themselves. Which raises a difficult question. If violence occurred, and no one fought to escape it, what does that say about expectation? Expectation is not consent. It's familiarity. And familiarity can be far more dangerous. The bedrooms told a similar story. Personal, but not intimate. Lived in, but not chaotic. Everything in its place, as if the house itself had learned how to behave. That's not a poetic observation. It's a psychological one. Spaces adapt to people over time. They absorb routines. They reflect power dynamics. A house where voices are raised sounds different from one where tension simmers quietly. This house had learned to be quiet. Investigators don't usually speak this way. They talk in terms of evidence, not atmosphere. But privately, some acknowledge that the scene felt restrained, as if something had been waiting for permission to happen. That's not something you can put in a report, but it's something that stays with you. The timeline, at first, seemed straightforward. Discovery, emergency call, arrival, confirmation. But timelines are only as honest as the questions they include. And one question wasn't being asked out loud yet. Why did no one hear anything? In a neighborhood where sound carries, where staff, neighbors, security systems often pick up disturbances, where silence itself can be suspicious, the answer may be mundane. Soundproofing, distance, timing, or it may point to something else entirely, because silence can be engineered. The more investigators examined the house, the clearer it became that this wasn't a place where unpredictability thrived. It was a place designed to minimize friction, to smooth over conflict, to keep everything operating within acceptable bounds. That works until it doesn't. And when it stops working, the break is often sudden. This is where the temptation to leap ahead becomes dangerous. To say, this must mean this. To draw straight lines between architecture and action. We're not doing that. What we're doing is paying attention. Because attention is what this story demands. Every detail matters not because it proves something, but because it reveals a pattern. And patterns are what Willie Nelson was talking about. Even if he never used that word, Willie knew Rob long enough to see the arc, not just the highlights. Long enough to recognize the difference between values spoken and values lived. And that's why his words feel less like commentary and more like context. He wasn't reacting to the crime. He was reacting to the moment when the crime made. Everything that happened within the boundaries of the family space. That doesn't determine culpability, but it does narrow the emotional field. Because when violence stays inside, it suggests a closed system, a pressure cooker that never vented. And pressure, over time, doesn't dissipate. It waits. The kitchen told a quieter story. Clean, maintained, nothing out of place. No signs of interruption mid-task. No half-finished meals. Life had paused neatly. That's unsettling in a way that mess never is. Mess suggests spontaneity, anger, panic. Order suggests control, right up until the moment control is lost. Outside, the guest house sat just far enough away to maintain plausible independence, close enough to remain connected. It embodied the family dynamic in physical form. Connected, but separate, present, but not fully inside. That arrangement had worked for years, until it didn't. And here's where the story tightens. Because when police spoke with the daughter, Romy, her language did not match the visual calm of the house. She didn't speak in absolutes. She didn't rush to conclusions. She spoke in terms of risk. Dangerous family member. That phrase did not come from the scene. It came from memory, from something that existed before the bodies were found. Which means the house wasn't just holding the end of the story. It was holding its middle. And that's the part we haven't heard yet. This is where the idea of the house as a container becomes unavoidable. Not metaphorically, structurally. It contained relationships, distance, silence. It allowed people to coexist without resolving what needed to be resolved. And for a long time, that containment worked. It protected reputations, preserved routines, kept discomfort from spilling into public view. But containment always has a breaking point. And when it breaks, the release is not always loud. Sometimes it's devastating precisely because it's quiet. This is the context Willie Nelson understood instinctively. He's seen houses like this before. Not this one, specifically, but this type. Places where power and restraint coexist uneasily. Where conflict is managed, not confronted. And when he finally spoke, he didn't talk about violence. He talked about character. That's not a coincidence. Because character is what shapes environments long before actions do. As the investigation continued, one detail kept resurfacing in off-the-record conversations. This didn't feel like a beginning. It felt like an ending. An ending to something that had been in motion for a very long time. And endings have origins. Origins live in habits, in patterns, in the small decisions people make every day to avoid conflict instead of addressing it. This house was built to support that avoidance. That's not an accusation. It's an observation. But it forces a question we can't avoid anymore. If the house was designed to keep everything contained, what happened when containment failed? And more importantly, what was being contained? Because the next place this story takes us isn't inside the house at all. It's inside the family dynamic that shaped it. And once we step there, the word dangerous starts to sound less like a reaction and more like a warning that had been waiting far too long to be heard. The first thing you notice about Romy Reiner, if you're paying attention, isn't her age or the fact that she's standing in the shadow of tragedy. It's her pause. The tiny hesitation before she frames what she knows in words that will reverberate through the investigation, through the public narrative, and through memory itself. Dangerous family member. That's what she said. And it matters. Not because it's legally binding. Not because it points immediately to guilt. But because it's not a word people throw around lightly. It implies history. It implies forewarning. It implies a sense that someone's presence or pattern was consistently unsafe. Think about that for a second. Dangerous. Not troubled. Not volatile. Not difficult. Dangerous. That's a term weighted with consequence. And in the context of a family, it's seismic. Romy's statement wasn't made on a microphone for a network. It wasn't polished. It wasn't intended for headlines. It was her attempt to frame what she knew for investigators, to create context, to signal, I tried to warn someone. Maybe I wasn't heard. The problem, as investigators quickly realized, is that history in families is rarely linear. It's layered, contained in gestures, in silences, in the spaces people avoid. And it's rarely fully visible to outsiders. Romy's choice of words became a starting point for a slow, careful reconstruction. Every detail she provided, from casual mentions of arguments to patterns of separation within the house, began to reveal a family dynamic that was far more complicated than it appeared in the press release. She described years of subtle tension, of a household operating on unspoken rules, rooms that were off-limits, conversations that ended when the wrong person walked in, boundaries that were respected, sometimes only because crossing them would trigger consequences no one wanted to name. And here's the thing. She didn't accuse. She didn't name names. She didn't insist on conclusions. She provided a lens, a frame. And frames, when interpreted carefully, can tell more than direct statements. Because the nuance in family memory is rarely convenient for investigators. It's messy. It's contradictory. It's punctuated by uncertainty. One day a member seems loving, the next day cold. 1 week safe, the next week threatening. And decades of that accumulation create patterns that are invisible until something finally fractures them. Which brings us back to the term she chose. Dangerous. It's a warning, but it's also an observation. It's the recognition that certain behaviors, repeated over time, create risk. Even if no one is actively trying to hurt anyone, patterns can become destructive. And the investigators had to reconcile that. Because a crime scene can show evidence of action, a body can show evidence of harm. But history? History is harder to document. It doesn't come with fingerprints or timestamps. It comes with memory, witness testimony, observation. And in this case, it came from someone who knew both the public and private versions of Rob Reiner. Someone living in proximity to patterns that had been normalized, that had been minimized, that had been compartmentalized. So the question becomes, what does a dangerous family member mean in practice? And how do you measure it? For investigators, the answer was elusive, because it's not about proving danger in a laboratory sense. It's about tracing behavioral patterns, noting escalation, and connecting private memory to visible fact. And when you're trying to reconcile decades of carefully managed household interactions with a sudden act of violence, every hesitation, every omission, every unspoken rule matters. Romy's perspective also introduces the complexity of perception. How do you separate fear from reality? How do you separate concern from foreknowledge? And perhaps most crucially, when someone calls a pattern dangerous, are they describing a person, an environment, or a combination of both? Family systems theory would suggest it's all three, that the household, the relationships, and the individual behaviors intersect to create a unique ecosystem, one that can buffer certain risks, but can also magnify others. And in the Reiner household, all signs suggested that the system was tightly controlled. Too tightly, perhaps. Control is subtle. It doesn't announce itself. You see it in the way people speak, or don't speak. You see it in the choreography of daily life. Who enters which room when, how much access is allowed, which conversations are deferred. And Romy, in her careful phrasing, was pointing directly at those patterns without ever having to dissect them verbally. It's also worth noting her age and role in the family. At 27, Romy had spent her formative years observing dynamics she may not have fully understood at the time. But memory, especially after trauma, has a way of crystallizing moments into patterns. Her words weren't casual recollections. They were distilled observations formed over years of living within a complex hierarchy. Which leads us to the next point, perception versus reality. Romy perceived a risk. Did that risk exist in the legal sense before the murders? Was it actionable? These are the questions law enforcement would later grapple with. And they illustrate a tension at the core of this story, the tension between lived experience and objective fact. And it's precisely this tension that Willie Nelson's words later echo. He didn't comment on the crime itself. He didn't assign blame. But he acknowledged the dissonance between public perception and private reality. He was observing the patterns that existed long before the tragedy occurred, patterns that Romy's warning encapsulates in a single, haunting phrase. The investigators had to thread this needle carefully. They could not rely solely on the verbal characterization of family members. They had to corroborate, to verify, to examine records, movements, communications, and histories. And yet, at every step, Romy's framing of danger guided the questions they asked. It shaped their understanding of the household ecosystem, even as it resisted simplification. And here's where narrative begins to twist. What is danger in a family setting? Is it purely physical, or is it psychological? Is it intent, or is it pattern? And who gets to decide when a pattern becomes threatening enough to warrant intervention? These are questions without easy answers, and they are precisely the questions that haunt this investigation. Because the definitions of danger, risk, and threat are often subjective. They are framed by experience, by memory, by the emotional landscape of those involved. And when those definitions collide with objective facts, bodies, evidence, timelines, the result is tension, contradiction, and uncertainty. As we move deeper into the story, Romy's words continue to resonate. They frame the context in which Nick lived, in which the parents maintained control, and in which the household functioned for years. Every subtle choice, who had access, who was permitted to intervene, what behaviors were normalized, becomes a piece of the puzzle. And her phrasing, intentional or not, signals that those pieces are more consequential than anyone realized at the time. And now we reach the uncomfortable intersection of narrative and implication. Romy's statement, dangerous family member, doesn't tell us who was responsible for what. It doesn't define guilt, but it does reveal the presence of a variable previously unaccounted for in public retellings. It draws attention to the spaces between action and inaction, to the responsibilities that go unclaimed in tightly managed households, and to the question that every observer now has to ask: how long can risk be contained before it manifests in the most irreversible way? And just as this realization settles, one more layer emerges. Patterns are never isolated. They are mirrored, reflected, and sometimes amplified by other members of the system. Observers, both inside and outside the household, contribute to the reinforcement or disruption of these dynamics. Every choice not to intervene, every dismissal of warning signs, every assumption that nothing serious will happen adds weight to an eventual tipping point. Which brings us back to Romy's words. Not as an accusation, not as a verdict, but as an early indicator of tension so embedded that it may have been invisible until the moment of rupture. And in that tension lies the real story, not only of what happened in the Brentwood estate, but of what had been quietly accumulating for years, shaping behavior, shaping decisions, shaping a family's fragile equilibrium, until it finally gave way. And once you understand that, you begin to see why Willie Nelson's later commentary resonates so profoundly. He isn't narrating the event that stunned Los Angeles. He is reflecting on the decades of human dynamics, decisions, and silences that made such a tragedy possible. And just as we are beginning to process this, another question surfaces, one that even Romy herself struggled to articulate. If a family can be simultaneously safe and dangerous, functional and volatile, observed yet opaque, what does that say about the assumptions we carry about home, about security, about trust? And more importantly, how do you measure danger before it becomes catastrophic? Because the next revelations won't just examine memory. They will examine choice, decisions made in rooms unseen, patterns repeated in silence, and moments where intervention could have altered the course of a life. Or ended it. When you start piecing together the Brentwood estate, the guest house is unavoidable. It sits slightly apart from the main house, separate yet visible, like a satellite hovering close enough to feel gravity, but distant enough to maintain autonomy. And that's exactly what it was for Nick Reiner. He wasn't a visitor. He wasn't a child who had left home years ago. He lived there, practically inside the orbit of the family, yet removed from the immediate domestic flow. And that positionality matters more than it might seem at first glance. Because proximity without intimacy is a fertile ground for tension. Investigators, when they first assessed the property, noted this quietly. There was no forced entry into the guest house, no evidence of an altercation spilling out. The interior reflected a life lived, furniture arranged for functionality, belongings organized, subtle markers of autonomy. But it wasn't a living room that hosted open conversation. It was a space that allowed observation. And observation is different from participation. Think about that. You can be close enough to witness behaviors, habits, and interactions without ever intervening. You can watch patterns repeat. You can note moods, shifts, tension, subtle conflicts. And that's exactly the position Nick occupied, which raises a question we can't ignore. How much did he see? How much did he understand? The answer, as it often is messy. Neighbors describe the young man as reserved, polite, and occasionally distant. Staff members spoke about his routines, precise, consistent, sometimes inflexible. Nothing about him suggested a lack of awareness. He was attuned, observant, capable of reading the environment around him. And yet, proximity did not translate to mediation. He did not intervene in daily frictions. He did not assume responsibility for patterns he observed. That's not a judgment. That's a structural reality. In families with clearly defined boundaries, autonomy is both a right and a responsibility. You can be part of a household without being part of its operational flow. And sometimes, that distinction is necessary to maintain peace. But peace in this context was fragile, because living near the epicenter of tension does not inoculate you from consequences. In fact, sometimes it amplifies them. You see the fractures more clearly. You know the pressure points. And when an equilibrium finally fails, those closest, even at a remove, bear witness in ways that complicate narrative. Investigators had to confront that reality. Nick's position in the guest house was not evidence of guilt, nor was it evidence of innocence. It was a fact, a context, a spatial reality that had implications for timelines, interactions, and potential exposure to conflict. And yet, what complicates everything is the human element, the choices we make in response to proximity. Nick's choices, for instance, had been consistent with a life seeking independence. He maintained his own space. He adhered to his routines. He engaged with the family selectively. He navigated patterns of tension without challenging them openly. And that non-engagement, in a household where patterns of danger existed, became a critical piece of the unfolding narrative. We often underestimate the weight of inaction in situations like this. It's easier to see the acts themselves. A confrontation, a raised hand, a broken object, than the decisions not to act, the moments when someone could intervene but does not. Yet those decisions, accumulated over years, create conditions that can turn catastrophic. Which brings us back to the central tension, the house as container. The guest house was more than a physical structure. It was a buffer, a layer of separation that maintained the illusion of safety while patterns of risk persisted. Nick lived inside that buffer. He could see, hear, sense, but he could also remain insulated. And that insulation, while protective, also limited his capacity to alter the trajectory of events. Consider this. How many young adults live close to family tension yet remain passive participants? It's common, it's understandable, and it's often invisible until something irreparable occurs. And then there's timing. Nick had been in the guest house long enough to internalize the rhythms of the household. He knew when doors closed, when conversations ended abruptly, when people avoided one another. He had lived with the subtle choreography of avoidance, learned the signs of escalation, and understood which behaviors were tolerated and which were suppressed. That knowledge matters. Because in investigations, context is everything. Proximity plus awareness equals responsibility, not legally, not automatically, but morally and emotionally. And the investigators had to navigate this carefully. They couldn't assume culpability, but they also couldn't dismiss the informational advantage that comes from living so close to the nucleus of tension. There were also reports of interactions with staff. Employees noted that Nick rarely disrupted household routines. He respected boundaries. He engaged selectively, observing rather than participating. That reinforced the notion that his lifestyle was consistent with someone seeking autonomy. But it also highlighted the contrast between observation and engagement. Watching patterns repeat is one thing. Acting to change them is another. Which leads us to the uncomfortable question: does proximity imply responsibility? In a legal sense, not necessarily. But in the human sense? Absolutely. And that's the tension at the heart of Nick's situation. He lived near potential risk, could perceive patterns, understood dynamics, and yet, like many in similar positions, opted for containment rather than confrontation. It's also worth noting the psychological dimension. Young adults in such households often internalize stress, develop coping mechanisms, and normalize patterns that might appear alarming to outsiders. Over time, this normalization can create blind spots. Events that would shock someone else are met with a measured response because the system has conditioned its inhabitants to expect tension without resolution. That conditioning is subtle, it's quiet, it's almost invisible, And when the system finally breaks, when violence erupts, those blind spots become critical. They define what people notice, what they fail to act upon, and how they process the aftermath. Which brings us back, inevitably, to the notion of containment. The guest house was a space designed for partial insulation, partial observation. It maintained distance from the main house, the epicenter of tension. But the closer you are, the more you absorb. And that absorption can distort perception, delay action, and create conditions for misjudgment. Investigators knew this. They documented timelines meticulously. They logged movements. They noted communications. And that pause tells us something about human behavior, about morality, and about observation. It tells us that sometimes understanding requires patience, that insight without immediacy can be more valuable than action with incomplete awareness. Willie's silence was not passive. It was active. It was engagement without interference, watching without participating. It is a discipline few people can maintain, especially when patterns of potential harm exist. It also suggests a profound understanding of human complexity. Public personas, private behaviors, family dynamics, these are rarely aligned neatly. Observing the gap requires discernment, subtlety, and, crucially, restraint. Willie's silence was informed by all three, but the silence was not indefinite. The tragedy, the murders, the arrest, the public exposure of family tension created conditions where silence was no longer viable. At that moment, speaking was no longer about intervention. It was about providing context, about framing understanding, about revealing patterns that had existed quietly but were now visible to all. And here is what makes his intervention so unsettling. He did not offer judgment. He did not issue condemnation. He did not sensationalize the events. He revealed insight. He highlighted divergence. He drew attention to the gap between appearance and reality. That distinction is critical. Ask yourself this. How often do we assume that public silence equals indifference? That quiet equals approval? That waiting equals neglect? Willie Nelson's approach complicates these assumptions. Silence, in this context, was a deliberate choice, an analytical tool, and a moral stance. Moreover, Willie's timing underscores the limitations of human observation. We often believe that noticing something obligates us to act immediately. But there is wisdom in waiting, especially when premature action could distort truth or provoke misinterpretation. He waited until the patterns were undeniable, the rupture unavoidable, and the context clear. And yet, even now, there's restraint in what he says. He does not assign blame. He does not declare guilt. He does not provide a forensic account. He describes patterns, identifies divergences, and leaves space for interpretation. That's intentional. It's a recognition that understanding often precedes judgment, that insight can exist without closure, and that truth can be more complex than the narratives people are ready to accept. His words also resonate with the theme of memory. For decades, events, behaviors, and interactions had accumulated in ways that were invisible to the public. The household functioned according to implicit rules, patterns, and hierarchies. Individuals observed, adapted, and sometimes complied, consciously or unconsciously. Memory, in this sense, is not merely recollection. It is interpretation, pattern recognition, and moral accounting over time. Willie's decades of observation function as a living memory, a repository of insight that now informs understanding in the wake of tragedy. And that leads to another critical point: timing and consequence. The longer one waits to speak, the greater the stakes. Decisions made or withheld in silence carry implications that extend far beyond the immediate moment. Willie's delay amplifies the significance of his insight. It frames the tragedy not as an isolated incident, but as the culmination of patterns, decisions, and silences that had persisted for years. There's also a lesson here about perception. Public figures, especially those in positions of influence or moral authority, are often judged solely by their outward behaviors, statements, and reputations. The private reality, the patterns of interaction, the subtle dynamics, the quiet pressures, is largely invisible. Willie's words expose that invisibility and challenge the audience to consider that reality often diverges from perception in ways that can have profound consequences. And so, the silence is not simply a narrative device. It is a framework for understanding. It allows the observer to accumulate context, interpret patterns, and discern complexity. It creates space for insight that immediate reaction could obscure. And in the Reiner case, it provides the lens through which the subsequent events, the daughter's warnings, Nick's proximity, the household patterns, can be interpreted with greater nuance. Finally, it's important to note the emotional dimension. Silence carries emotional weight. For Willie, speaking now does not merely share observation. It carries grief, recognition, and the ethical weight of hindsight. The timing, content, and tone of his words are deliberate. They are measured. They convey concern without sensationalism, context without accusation, and insight without closure. And that's precisely why the next chapter matters. Because understanding the timing of Willie Nelson's silence allows us to frame the events leading up to the tragedy in a way that accounts for observation, memory, and moral complexity. It prepares us to analyze the patterns of behavior, containment, and emotional dynamics that shaped the household over decades, patterns that culminated in the events that stunned Los Angeles and captivated public attention. And once we shift our focus from observation to articulation, the story deepens. Because speaking the truth, even in hindsight, transforms memory into narrative, observation into interpretation, and silence into context. It's a deceptively simple phrase, short, measured, almost casual in tone. But beneath those 6 words lies a weight that's hard to overstate. Not the man you think he was. What does it mean? That's the question that has haunted anyone listening to Willie Nelson's statement. It doesn't accuse. It doesn't condemn. It doesn't explain the events of that night in Brentwood. It doesn't even explain the years leading up to it. What it does is introduce doubt, not about actions in a legal sense, but about perception, expectation, and the divergence between public image and private reality. It's the kind of phrasing designed to unsettle quietly, to make you question what you assume you know. And that's why it lands so powerfully. The statement is a disruption. It destabilizes certainty without shouting. It forces reflection, and it demands attention precisely because it refuses to offer closure. To understand why, you need to consider the context. Rob Reiner had lived a life largely in public view. His persona was coherent, consistent, and, in many ways, comforting. He was a moral authority, a cultural figure, a voice of reason in political discourse. The public saw the outline of a man defined by principles, philanthropy, and advocacy. That outline became his identity in the collective imagination. But identity, especially public identity, is not the same as experience. And Willie Nelson knew that. He had been close enough to observe patterns, small, seemingly inconsequential interactions that, over time, painted a far more complicated picture. Moments of tension smoothed over, words chosen carefully, behaviors modified subtly, consistently, to maintain equilibrium. And these patterns, unnoticed by the casual observer, mattered. They shaped the household. They defined interactions. They influenced the perceptions of the family members themselves. So when Willie spoke, he wasn't pointing to a single act, a single decision, or a single night. He was pointing to the arc, the accumulation, the long, quiet unfolding of dynamics that the public never saw, because they were private, subtle, contained. It's a dissonance that's difficult for people to grasp. We want clear narratives. We want heroes and villains. We want right and wrong. But this phrase, not the man you think he was, forces us to live with ambiguity, to recognize that a life can be simultaneously admirable and flawed, principled and conflicted, public and private in ways that don't neatly align. And there's an irony here. The very traits that made Rob Reiner admirable in public, control, composure, clarity of purpose, also facilitated the concealment of private turbulence. The more coherent the public persona, the easier it became for private inconsistencies to hide in plain sight. The more he maintained his image, the more patterns of avoidance, tension, and restrained conflict could persist without detection. Ask yourself, how many people do we know only through their public actions? How often do we assume that the character projected to the world is complete? And what happens when the hidden dimensions of a person collide violently with circumstance, revealing fissures we never imagined? Willie's statement is a meditation on that collision. It does not sensationalize. It does not offer closure. Instead, it situates the tragedy within a larger pattern, a life where perception and reality diverged for years, where silence accumulated, and where private complexity quietly escalated toward rupture. And the timing amplifies the impact. At 92, Willie Nelson speaks not as a participant seeking recognition or as a witness recounting details, but as a historian of human behavior. He is reflecting on decades of observation. He is weighing patterns, behaviors, and interactions that others might dismiss as inconsequential. And the choice to speak now, after tragedy, carries emotional and moral significance. It signals that the divergence he observed mattered, that it had consequences, and that silence, even when prudent, can reach a point where the truth must be acknowledged. The power of the statement also lies in what it does not reveal. Willie does not detail specific events. He does not describe arguments, confrontations, or moments of crisis. He simply notes that the reality behind the public persona is not what most people assume. That's subtle. It's precise. It's profoundly unsettling because it leaves the mind filling in gaps, wondering what he saw, what he knew, and what patterns persisted for decades without public notice. And that brings us to the emotional texture of the statement. Saying, "Not the man you think he was," carries with it a quiet grief, a recognition that human lives are complicated, and a lament for the ways in which appearances can mask reality. It acknowledges disappointment without blame, complexity without moral judgment, and consequences without dramatization. For investigators, reporters, and observers alike, this is the most challenging kind of insight to process. It's not evidence in a traditional sense. It's context. It's a lens. It shapes how past actions are interpreted, how patterns are understood, and how the tragedy itself is framed. It's also a warning. A caution against assuming that public perception is sufficient to understand private dynamics. It suggests that even the most familiar people, those we believe we know, may harbor unseen behaviors, interactions, and pressures that influence outcomes in ways we cannot predict. And here's where the tension intensifies, because the phrase invites reflection not only on Rob Reiner, but also on the household, the family, and the environment that both enabled and contained certain patterns. It asks the audience to consider responsibility, observation, and intervention. It challenges assumptions about safety, proximity, and awareness. And it forces a confrontation with the uncomfortable truth that appearances can be deceiving, sometimes fatally so. As we move forward into the next chapter, the story shifts from reflection to narrative, from pattern to event, from observation to incident. Willie's words set the stage for a closer examination of a specific night, a night that was never supposed to be remembered publicly, but whose echoes now resonate through testimony, investigation, and memory. Because while the phrase, "not the man you think he was," sets the tone for understanding decades of private behavior, the events that follow demonstrate the consequences when private realities collide with inevitability. There are nights in life that pass almost invisibly. Nights where nothing seems to happen, and yet, years later, they loom large because of what they presaged. The night in question here is one of those nights, a night that, until recently, had remained unrecorded in public accounts, undocumented in the media, unremarked upon by anyone outside the immediate household. And yet, it was central to understanding everything that followed. It didn't begin with violence. It didn't erupt suddenly. There was no screaming, no alarms, no call to the police. On the surface, it was ordinary. A dinner finished, a conversation deferred, a few rooms emptied as people retreated to their own spaces. And yet, for those attuned to the household's subtle rhythms, it carried an unmistakable tension. Investigators, speaking off the record, described it as the night where patterns became momentarily transparent. Moments of avoidance became visible. Repetition became predictive. Silence became communicative. And for those within earshot, it was clear that something had shifted, something that had long been constrained by habit, routine, and unspoken rules. Romy's recollections place her squarely in the orbit of that night. She did not describe an argument in conventional terms. She did not recount a confrontation or an outburst. She described subtleties, a door left ajar, a glance exchanged, a hesitancy in speech that spoke volumes. The daughter's observations indicate that the household's equilibrium had begun to crack, even if no one yet realized the magnitude of the fracture. Nick, in the guest house, perceived some of these shifts differently. From his vantage, patterns that seemed threatening from the main house might appear mundane. Routines were repeated, minor tensions surfaced and dissipated. And without active intervention or a clear understanding of what constituted real danger, the night passed with a deceptive calm. But the investigators emphasized a crucial detail. The night, though outwardly uneventful, was the first observable deviation from established household norms. The rhythm had been interrupted, however subtly. The equilibrium had been tested. And for a household long accustomed to managing tension through containment and distance, that deviation was significant. Willie Nelson's later commentary contextualizes this night in a broader pattern. He did not speak about the night itself in forensic terms, nor did he provide a timeline of incidents. He instead framed it as illustrative of a larger truth, that private behavior often diverges from public perception, and that small, unnoticed deviations can accumulate into outcomes that feel sudden but are, in fact, long in gestation. The night also illuminates a critical psychological dynamic: habituation. Members of the household had adapted to tension over years, learning to interpret and internalize signs of volatility. They had developed coping mechanisms, routines, retreats, avoidance strategies that allowed them to navigate friction without immediate confrontation. But habituation has limits. Patterns that are normalized for decades can become brittle. A slight deviation, a subtle misalignment, a moment of hesitation can trigger a cascade of unanticipated responses. From an investigative perspective, the night offered a rare lens into how these patterns manifested. Objects were in place. Rooms were orderly. No visible signs indicated that anything had gone awry. Yet, memory and testimony reveal an undercurrent of unease. Glances, unspoken exchanges, gestures that communicated anxiety, control, or unease. These intangible elements, while impossible to measure empirically, form the foundation for understanding the household's internal dynamics. And then there's the emotional layer. On that night, the interplay of fear, anticipation, and loyalty coexisted with the everyday rhythms of domestic life. Family members were negotiating boundaries, respecting routines, and managing interactions, all while internalizing an unspoken calculus of risk. Small choices, gestures, and decisions carried disproportionate weight precisely because of the history of containment and the stakes implicit in maintaining equilibrium. Romy, reflecting years later, indicated that the night felt different without being dramatic. She could not articulate why, at the time, it had seemed notable. Only in hindsight, after the events unfolded, did the significance become clear. This underscores a recurring theme. The most consequential moments often appear insignificant until the broader trajectory is understood. Similarly, Nick's position in the guest house provided him partial visibility but limited interpretive capacity. He could observe patterns but could not fully discern the meaning of subtle cues. His distance insulated him from immediate danger, yet it also limited his ability to intervene, influence outcomes, or anticipate escalation. This tension between observation and influence is central to understanding the household's dynamics leading up to the tragedy. And Willie Nelson's later reflection situates the night within a continuum. His observation is not about the specifics of behavior on that night, but about the pattern that night exemplified, the way private reality can diverge from public perception, how silences and routine can mask tension, and how deferred acknowledgement of risk can magnify consequences. This night also reveals the limitations of perception within families. Individuals attuned to patterns may recognize signals, but habituation, denial, and normalization can prevent recognition from translating into action. And this gap between observation and intervention is precisely the space where risk accumulates. As investigators pieced together the household's internal flow, it became evident that the night was emblematic of a larger systemic dynamic. Patterns that had been reinforced over years, boundaries, separations, avoidance, containment, were temporarily disrupted. The household's equilibrium, though superficially maintained, had begun to reveal cracks. And those cracks were not immediately visible. They existed in the timing of interactions, the tone of conversation, the choice to retreat rather than confront. The unremarkable details, a glance, a pause, a minor adjustment in behavior, were the signals of a system under strain. It's in that subtle strain that the tragedy finds its prelude. Not in an overt confrontation, but in the accumulation of patterns, choices, and silences that made the event not entirely unpredictable, at least not to those who had long observed the household dynamics. And here's where the narrative turns a corner. Because understanding the night is not enough. The night gains significance in relation to what came before and what followed. It is a hinge point. A moment where the internal pressures of the household first expressed themselves in a form noticeable to those who were paying attention, and yet invisible to those outside. Which brings us to a critical observation. Patterns in isolation are often invisible. It is only when juxtaposed against subsequent events that the full significance emerges. The night in question illustrates the tension between habitual containment and the potential for rupture. It underscores the role of memory, perspective, and interpretation in shaping understanding. And finally, it points directly to the insight Willie Nelson would later offer. He spoke not about isolated incidents, but about patterns, accumulations of behavior, interactions, and choices that ultimately defined the reality of the household. His words, measured and deliberate, cast the night into a broader temporal framework, connecting the past, the present, and the consequences that emerged with devastating clarity. And just as we begin to